Before I begin my lecture, I want to tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm here. I founded the Maimonides Institute for Medicine, Ethics, and the Holocaust in 2015 as a way to explore the ramifications of the unethical practices that took place during the Holocaust for modern medicine, science, public policy, health law, and human rights efforts. In June 2017, Dr. Tessa Shalush and I started the Department of Bioethics and the Holocaust of the UNESCO Chair of Bioethics to bring together scholars from around the world interested in doing this work. Shortly thereafter, I became the director of the Center for Human Dignity in Bioethics, Health, and the Holocaust at Misericordia University, a Catholic school founded by the Sisters of Mercy in Northeast Pennsylvania and the first academic institution dedicated to the study of bioethics and the Holocaust. Through these various platforms, I've been fortunate enough to be able to lecture to audiences of all ages throughout the world and teach them about the importance of bioethics and the Holocaust, human dignity, justice, and equality. I consider myself to be an academic activist, and the goal of my work is to protect the future by remembering the past. I'm also Jewish, and last night, for the first time in my nearly 40 years of existence, I experienced an act of blatant anti-Semitism on the streets of Krakow hours after visiting Auschwitz. So when people ask me why I do what I do, the answer is simple. The Holocaust is an essential component of Jewish history, but it's also a central component of medical history, and most important, it is a central component of human history. It demonstrates what can happen when we stop treating each other as individuals and instead view people as a means to an end, something to be altered or removed on the way to creating a more perfect society. When we label, when we dehumanize and medicalize and place scientific or societal progress ahead of basic human dignity. How can we ensure that something like this never happens again? The same way I can try and stop the next anti-Semitic incident or any incident based on hatred and intolerance from happening again. We can remember. We can bear witness to the stories of the victims and the survivors, and we can educate the next generation. So I thank you all for being here today, for actively taking a role in commemorating and educating and in fulfilling our promise of never again. When we talk about the Holocaust, what makes it different? Why are we all sitting here today? The Holocaust is the only example of medically sanctioned genocide in history, and as such, it has a unique relevance for the medical profession and for the concepts of ethics and human dignity. During the beginning of the 1900s, eugenics was a very, very popular scientific theory, and we have to understand that. Thank you. We have to understand that German eugenics, though, was different than eugenics in other parts of the world. German eugenics had a unique perspective based on a system of ethics that placed society above the individual. And that's really important to understand. The concept of the Volk, the German nation, as a living, breathing organism with its own health and hygiene, and individuals were of value only based on what they could contribute to the Volk. So those were deemed unfit weren't to be given medical help in the same way that when you think of a doctor, you think of somebody who provides medical assistance to those in need, the vulnerable. The prevailing medical ethos of the time was not to help the individual, but instead to do what was in the best interest of society. And this shift in caring for the individual, instead not to care for them, but to care for society, that was the most important thing. That's extremely important to understand from a general ethical perspective and from a medical ethical perspective. The blatant violation of the Hippocratic oath to heal That is what we're talking about. That is what was at the heart of the crimes that were discussed when we talk about the doctor's trial at Nuremberg. And that is what we're talking about when we talk about the birth of bioethics. Why? Why did this come out of Nuremberg? Why did this come out of the Holocaust, medically sanctioned genocide? This is what we're talking about. So it's important to understand up to this point the history of medical and research ethics, because interestingly, both the prosecution and the defense used the same argument, this history of medical research ethics, in their arguments here. So the prosecution went back in history to Hippocrates, who emphasized beneficence and non-maleficence as a moral imperative of the physician. They talked about Percival, who in 1803 created one of the earliest codes of professional medical ethics. In that code, he explicitly mentions research ethics and advocates for the necessity of scientific research, but only in cases where traditional medical treatment had failed. Beaumont's 1833 Code of Ethics is largely regarded as the first documented code of ethics to include voluntary informed consent. And in 1865, Bernard published his seminal work, An Introduction to the Study of Experimental Medicine, in which he referenced beneficence and non-maleficence and basically said human experimentation that harms one population solely for the benefit of another should never be allowed. So basically, in summary, the prosecution is saying, hey, look at the history here. We have a history that says that the physician must act in the best interest of the patient. But the defense used the same argument. The defense said, we too want to cite the history of research ethics. But you have to understand research ethics in the context of German medical ethics, in the context of the Third Reich, which was very advanced at the time, but also very, very enmeshed and intertwined with the political regime, and therefore very vulnerable to political and social influence. So if you go back and you look at German medical ethics, and I think this is something that's important to understand, Germany had a very advanced system of medical ethics. When we look back today, it's not necessarily what we would agree with. As you saw before, when we talk about German eugenics, it emphasized things, like I said, caring for society as opposed to caring for the individual. But there was a system of ethics that was present. And they had codes of ethics. They had the regulations on new therapy and human experimentation, which was published in 1931. The difference being that it was published by the German Ministry of the Interior, making it a government document as opposed to just the ethics literature that the prosecution referenced. As we know, Nazi ideology politicized medicine and medical research. So medicine and research in Nazi Germany was self-regulated. And the defense made the case that as long as the medical profession complied with the politics and the policies of the Third Reich, what they were doing was ethical, because you have to look at it in context, which is important to understand. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so that begs the question, how is it possible that both the prosecution and the defense were able to use the history of modern research ethics as their argument? So here we have this problem, and we have the defense saying they're using this, self-regulation. And the obvious issue is not going unnoticed here. We're saying, okay, the explicit purpose of the trial is not to explore the concept of research ethics, but it became impossible to ignore this larger problem that we need a universal international set of standards to ensure ethical human subject experimentation that is not self-regulated, that is not vulnerable to social or political coercion. The trial highlighted serious issues within research ethics, basic questions and concepts that needed to be addressed. What are research ethics? What is the actual definition? What guides research ethics? How do we define these key terms? Can we come up with an objective system of ethical guidance? And the fact that we don't have anybody responsible for overseeing any of this. So what do? The proposed solution is the Nuremberg Code. So we have the judgment at Nuremberg, which includes the establishment of a universal guiding principle to govern human subject experimentation. Now, again, keep in mind, this is very unique again, because we have the tribunal not just taking a stand on guilt or innocence, but actually creating a universal set of guidelines that's intended to set the general agenda for all future ethical and legal questions. And I highlighted this in red. You can see, how willing are we to risk human life to serve individual or societal ends? These are the questions. I don't know what happened. These are the questions that we're facing here. And that is what led to the development of the Nuremberg Code, the Constitution of Bioethics and Research Ethics, which, as I'm sure that everyone in this room is probably aware of, the big thing here is the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential, because what do we all know about the medical experimentation, right? It was basically torture. It was done on prisoners who were not given the opportunity for any type of say in what happened to them. So this is what happens, and we place autonomy in the form of mandatory informed consent above all other principles. So the trajectory of research ethics to this point, we have before the Holocaust, the concepts of beneficence and non-maleficence were often included as part of medical ethics, as you can see in the Hippocratic Oath. And we have ethical codes that were largely created and enforced from within the profession. Medicine and politics are operating sometimes together, sometimes not, but there's not so much of a problem when they're operating together. But then after the Holocaust, we have new things that come about. We have justice and autonomy given priority in research ethics, as you see in the Nuremberg Code. We have a need for the existence of legal or societal instruments to hold physicians and researchers accountable. And we have the medical profession no longer being trusted as capable of resisting political pressure. So this, of course, then leads to the development of international codes of ethics. So in the US, what happens after the Nuremberg Code is published? We ignore it. We go, yeah, that's not a code for the US. We're not doing any of these really horrible things. This is a code for barbarians, like the Nazi doctors. Except the problem with that is we absolutely were doing unethical medical experiments at the time. And this comes to light via Henry K. Beecher's 1966 article that's published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and most notably the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. So this makes it very clear that the US needs our own system of external regulation. We developed the Belmont Code. Internationally, we have the Declaration of Helsinki, which is a response to practical issues with the idea of mandatory voluntary informed consent set forth by the Nuremberg Code and the difficulty that that causes in allowing vulnerable populations to benefit from the potential advances in medical research. And then we have the CIOMS guidelines, which were developed due to the increase in international human subject research between developed and developing nations, particularly in response to the pharmaceutical companies and their unethical practices around the HIV/AIDS clinical drug trials. So we also have the Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights, where in Article 3, we say human dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms to be fully respected. The interests and welfare of the individual should have priority over the sole interest of science or society, although you will find that this entire document, which is based on the concept of human dignity, again, never explicitly defines what human dignity is. So again, a continued lack of clarity regarding key concepts. However, at this point, we have accepted that whether or not we can define it, we know that the respect for human dignity is essential, and we need to respect it. And we look to the Holocaust as evidence that we cannot spend our time harping on theoretical principle, right? Because what mattered most after 1945 was not reaching agreement as to the theoretical foundations of human dignity, but ensuring as a practical matter that the worst atrocities inflicted on large populations during the war would not be repeated. So we understand that this is we need something practical. Each new code that was developed in response to a new scandal. And because of that, we have all of these different scandals within different countries, within different historical eras that lack a universal applicability. So the question still remains, what makes human subject research ethical? We know we need a code of ethics. It's necessary, but it's insufficient. So there's no way, we haven't figured out a way for codes to be universally standardized, applied, and enforced. So we need a paradigm shift. We have advances in technology that are continuing. We know they're going to continue, and that's only going to further complicate this issue. We have changes to what constitutes research, how it's being done, by whom it's being conducted. We couldn't keep up before. How are we going to keep up in the 21st century and beyond? And so, as with most issues in bioethics, the key here is balance. So please understand that in no way am I trying to minimize the importance of scientific progress. We need scientific progress. And the advances made in science and medicine in the last decade alone are nothing short of miraculous. But there's always a flip side, right? And in this case, that flip side is prioritizing the potential for scientific or societal advancement above the protection of individual rights and human dignity. We saw self-regulation alone didn't work. Codes of ethics alone don't seem to be working either. So how do we fix this problem? We reflect on the past in order to protect the future. We teach. We teach the lessons of the Holocaust for physicians and researchers. We instill in them a moral ethos that values human dignity and ethical treatment, not because a code of ethics tells them to do so, but because it's the right thing to do. We teach that physicians and researchers must have the ability and the integrity to go against the system when it becomes corrupted. Because the more checks and balances we have in place, the better. The more we teach about what can happen when we abandon the basic ethical tenets of medicine and humanism, the better. The more we educate about this very important time in history and its relevance for modern society, the better. We use every weapon at our disposal without relying solely on internal motivation or external oversight to create a new generation of researchers and practitioners that remain vigilant to ensure that the rights of the individual are respected and protected. And with that being said, to that end, with the support of many of the people and organizations in this room, we've created a pledge to preserve human dignity in healthcare that each one of you can take right now by going to the website that you see here. You see I'm wearing this little pin, and this pin shows my commitment to preserving human dignity in healthcare, my commitment to reflecting on the past to protect the future, to create a world in which each person is treated with dignity and respect. I have these pins, I have pledge cards, I have hard copies that you can sign if you don't want to sign online, and I encourage you. I thank you for being here. I thank Peter and Maria for organizing such an important event. And I encourage each one of you to take the pledge to preserve human dignity in healthcare, to continue your efforts to educate, to stand up, and to speak out to ensure that this never happens again. Thank you very much.